Alright, everybody, welcome to our first Game Dev Cast of 2020. I'm, of course, Josh Beister of Game Wisdom, and we have another interesting discussion to begin the year with. We're going to be discussing multiplayer balance when it comes to competitive games and some of the challenges that go into it. As YouTube turns on my speaker there. But my guest tonight, he is returning as the creative lead on Revn, which we did a spotlight interview with him earlier in actually near the end of 2019. Please welcome back to the cast, Silas.
Hey, thanks, Josh. Thanks for having me back on here.
Great.
It's great to chat with you.
Yep, it's great to have you back on. I hope you had a great New Year and holiday.
I did, yeah, thank you. Unfortunately, I didn't get to take a lot of time off. Spent most of the holidays actually working on a couple of really big patches for the game. We rolled that out. I think the last day of 2019, we rolled out our biggest patch ever, and I've just been kind of recovering ever since then. This last weekend was really my first weekend off since Christmas, but I think everything's back to a good pace now, and I'm excited to get into the new year.
Yeah, I know the feeling. I kind of had a semi-forced vacation when all the places I've been calling for presentations closed, but that just meant I had more YouTube work to do and more writing. So the work never ends. It just is where I focus my attention on a day-to-day basis.
Right.
But it's great to have you back on. We certainly have a very interesting topic to discuss. So, for those of you new watching this, I'll include a link to our previous cast with Silas in the description down below for the recorded folks. But, very quickly, for any new people watching who missed it, what is Revn and how would it apply to our discussion about multiplayer balance?
Oh yeah, so Revn is a third-person shooter, but it also has a lot of MOBA elements. So I like to say that it's a third-person shooter MOBA hybrid game. So in terms of game balance, there's both the aspects of it being a shooter and the aspects of it being a MOBA that we have to balance. So that's things like leveling and items and abilities that we have to balance for the MOBA side of it. And from a shooting standpoint, we also want to make sure that the game feels good. So that's sort of sometimes goes against what might be typical good balance in a MOBA to have things take this amount of time to kill someone, while in a shooter that might feel like a bullet sponge. So it's sort of a balancing act we have to do between what is expected in a MOBA and what is expected in a shooter.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, so Revn being this sort of hybrid genre presents a lot of really interesting scenarios. I don't know if I want to call them problems, but they're very interesting scenarios that we have to solve for.
Yep. And as with this topic, when we talk about multiplayer balance, it's a very tricky one because it really depends on kind of the design of the game as well as what are the actual options you're building for. Like when we talk about multiplayer, we can talk on the small scale, it's just a symmetrical multiplayer. Two teams of the same players competing with each other. But we can go as far as full on asymmetry when we get to stuff like Overwatch, what you're doing with Red with the different powers, League of Legends, you name it, where side A has abilities and options that side B doesn't have. And then becomes a case of how do you balance? It's not really apples to apples, or even apples to oranges in this case. And it has become, I think, one of the more challenging topics whenever we talk about any kind of multiplayer game.
Yeah, that sort of asymmetrical balance. We try to keep things as symmetrical as possible in terms of map design, but there are symmetry differences.
Mm-hmm.
And sort of keeping everyone on the same page is really important to me. But at the same time, like you're not going to end up with each team with the same composition.
Mm-hmm.
So you can't just be like, oh well, this team has the same guns as the other team. So like in that case, it's obviously immediately balanced.
Yeah.
We're doing tons of balancing there. Right now, I would say, since we're still in an alpha state, most of our balance is around what feels good and like what's
Mm-hmm.
fun, and less concerned about what's maybe the ideal balance. We're more concerned about making sure everything is fun and making sure that every ability and item in the game is viable in some scenario. And
Mm-hmm.
then once we have that's our main thing right now. Like if something is just completely non-viable, then it needs a rework, right? And that was something we were running into recently. with a couple of abilities actually. So we did, I think, two or three ability reworks in our big patch recently.
Mm-hmm.
One of those was for our riot shield ability. So it's very similar to a lot of shield abilities in a lot of games. The character holds out his hand and he deploys this energy force field thing that he carries around, and it blocks bullets. And the idea was that it would help tank players push up on the objective. And the original design for it, it had a health bar, and it also had a cooldown and a duration.
Okay.
So when you activated it, it had, I don't know, it had like 100 health, and it would last for a maximum of 30 seconds. And when we put it away, it was in cooldown for I think 10 seconds. Um, that was awful. It was probably the least used, most useless ability in the game because you couldn't shoot your gun while you were using it, so you could only move, and you had
Okay.
this thing in front of you with limited health, and if you put it away or it was destroyed, it immediately went into this 10-second cooldown,
Okay.
and so it was horrible. Like there was really no good way to use it. It didn't really. You could pop it up and maybe you'd survive an extra couple seconds, but the fact that it was going to go down and then you wouldn't really be able to interact with the ability anymore, it wasn't
Mm-hmm.
really that good. So we talked a lot about different ways to solve that problem, and we looked at what a lot of different games do for shields. And I think the first thing we saw as a problem was the cooldown of when you put it away. In most games with a shield ability like this, you want to be able to activate it and deactivate it pretty much
Mm-hmm.
at will, so that you can throw up your shield, advance a little bit, put it away, fire back, and
Yep.
then put it back up. And so that was the first thing we looked at was okay, we have to get rid of the cooldown. Um, and that also meant getting rid of the duration timers. I think so
Mm-hmm.
that well, that was another decision we had to make was well, can you hold it up indefinitely or is it a limited time while you're holding it up?
Yep.
And I guess that is another route we could have gone. We decided to get rid of the duration. We could have made it well, you can activate it at any time, but then you can hold it active for a maximum of 10 seconds or whatever. But we decided to go with you can have it up for as long as you want. You can turn it on and off at will. And then the thing we did was it has the health bar. We had to think about well, when does the health bar refill, right? Does it because we used to have the health bar was it just refilled every time you cast it, which is why we had that big long
Yeah.
cooldown. But obviously you can't have that anymore if you can recast it at will. So we ended up putting a cooldown on the health bar regen so that after you had put it away for I believe 20 seconds, then the health bar regenerated back to full.
Mm-hmm.
So it sort of and then that really solved the design issues around that item. So now it has ways to interact, and I think it's useful. But we're still not sure if it's fully balanced in terms of stats and things. And that's something we probably need to start looking at from more
Yeah.
of a like a data analysis standpoint. We need to start recording. Okay, well, how long does it take a sniper rifle to bring the shield down? How long does it take a rocket launcher or a shotgun or a pistol, and make sure that those all feel right? Um,
Yeah.
because I think we've made it viable, but now we need to make it feel good, and then we can also figure out is it really truly useful.
Yeah. And that is a really good example, Silas, of just like in a nutshell, really some of the challenges of that kind of multiplayer design. There's a lot that you touched on, like the last 4 minutes, that we could probably spend like an hour on for each one of those. Like the first point about the fact that it was horrible to use to begin with. Like that right there is one of the big challenges of whenever we have asymmetry in a multiplayer game. Does my cool toy work against your cool toy? Or
Right.
is there, the quote unquote redhead stepchild option in this game? Is there something so bad? Why would I take, the puny knife weapon if I can take the BFG that sits right next to it? Why would I ever want that one option?
Right.
And as you were saying there with the original concept of the shield, it also becomes a factor of how somebody plays a game to begin with. If your game is a super fast paced shooter, you don't want skills to have long cooldowns or just extended periods of inactivity because 5 seconds in a game like Overwatch or Team Fortress, that can be an eternity in terms of when you can use that skill again.
Yeah.
And yeah,
No, you're right. Yeah. It's it's very important to make sure that it's viable in at least one scenario.
Mm-hmm.
I think the thing that I think people forget a lot of times is that we don't need to make every single action in game, every ability, every weapon. It doesn't need to be viable in every scenario. We just
Exactly.
need to make sure there's at least one scenario where it's good. And then from there, it's just okay. Well, it's at least good for this one thing, and that's really what we're looking at right now. Because if it's not good for anything, then why is it in the game?
Exactly. And that's another major point when you start balancing against other features. If it becomes so good that it works in every scenario, then you run the opposite problem. Why should I take something else if, the shield instantly recharges, can block any damage, I can use it whenever and however long I want? Then it becomes like, then the whole game becomes everybody uses shield, or as we all know from metagame design, everybody uses the counter to shield, and that
Right.
all your other choices don't matter.
Yeah, I think that having that making your choices matter and have there is a way to make something work. But really, like another thing that we have to like look at is making sure that we communicate that to the players that this is like the correct way to use this item,
Mm-hmm.
or at least like this is a correct way to use it because I think that we have in my game there's some abilities that we've designed that they're not really readily apparent why they're good or why they're useful. And I think that just comes down to like a complexity in the meta where you might be like, well, why would I use, and I'm trying to think of an example, why would I use, we have an ability where your next shot that you take will stun the enemy.
Mm-hmm.
That is probably one of the harder trick shots to pull off in the game because you have to land your next shot. Otherwise, you just wasted the ability. So I think a
Mm-hmm.
lot of like beginner players won't want to take that. If you're not really good at shooters, that's just not.
Of
If you
course.
miss that one shot, you're gonna feel like, well, why didn't I pick a different ability?
Yep.
So that's sort of another thing we have to acknowledge is that okay, these are complex abilities. These are easier to master. And that's something that just from a sort of an economy standpoint, because we're starting to build in our storefront for unlocking the abilities. um, we're starting to sort of take that into consideration with okay, the more complicated abilities we will put where you unlock those later in the game, right? So you get your first experiences with the things that are the easiest to pull off and succeed with.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
The less risky maneuvers.
Yeah, and I see a Thorn just asked you a question in chat there.
Yeah, I see that. He asked, "Am I shooting for what things like League and Dota do, where they have a rotation through patching? You know that gun X is OP, but that's fine because gun Y will be OP next month." Yeah, that's sort of what we're planning to do. I'm not sure actually if League and Dota really plan to make anything OP. I don't. I If I had to guess, I don't think they plan to make anything OP. They're like, yeah, next month, Garen's gonna be OP. Everyone's gonna play Garen in February. Just buy the skins now. You're playing Garen next month. I don't think they set out to do that. I think it's a constant juggling act. I want to say it's like a teeter totter. You're trying to balance it, but that's actually solvable. It's more like juggling. It's always in motion,
Juggling
and
on
you're just
teeter
trying to
totters, I think.
yeah, you're just trying to keep it from falling apart.
Mm-hmm.
Once you have that many pieces involved, and yeah, that's sort of what our goal is. Our goal is to have you know uh, hundreds,
Mm-hmm.
dozens if not hundreds of abilities in the game that you can choose from, and it'll be yeah, there'll be stuff that's good right now, and then as we patch, it might not be as good because we
Mm-hmm.
introduce something new that's just straight up just better. I think that happens a lot. The interesting thing that I like to think about sometimes is Magic the Gathering, which is a game that I play a lot of, and I study a lot for how they balance things and how they evolve their game and their meta. Because they can't patch the game really. Like they patch the game, in the sense that they release new content every couple of months, but they can never go back and fix their mistakes. They can't go back and buff a certain card that they released a couple of years ago. They have to release a new card, and then that new card just is that supersedes the old
Yep.
card, right? And like that's the only thing they can do. But I don't think they like doing that because then the people who have invested in the old cards feel invalidated. So like they have I do not envy their balancing job because like they
No.
have to get it right the first time they release it, because if it's not correct, it just the entire meta shifts around it immediately. Like if they just release something and it's super strong, the entire game in the standard format goes around it. The only thing they can do is they can do bans, like Thorin just mentioned in chat. You
Hmm.
ban a card, just take it out completely, but you can't like say, yeah, actually that should have cost one more mana because of how strong it was.
Just take a mark and add a one to that to everybody's copy of that card. And
Yeah, like you just can't do that. And so like I'm really lucky and thankful that I get to work
hmm
in a medium with video games where if we mess up, we can fix it next week. We can fix it in 2 hours if we move fast, right?
yeah.
And push out a hot fix. Like we can catch those things and respond to them in real time.
hmm
Um, and that's just sort of something I think about those, like with Magic, how you do have scenarios where there's this card, and then for example lands, which are like the most simple thing. Like it's basically your resource cards, right? I don't know if you play Magic the Gathering, but
Oh, like once that was about the
okay.
extent there.
All right, so I'll explain it for you and any of our viewers who haven't, or listeners who haven't played it. But basically, lands are cards that you can activate once a turn that give you mana, which is your resource to cast your other spells. And typically, you play with lands that have one color of mana on it. There's 5 colors total in the game. So it's white, red, blue, black, and green. Um, and typically, you have a land, you can tap it for one color. So you would have a forest that taps for green. But then you have these cards that you can tap for one or the other color. Uh, so, for example, there's a card that you can tap for tapping is how you activate a card, so to call it. So you can activate this card for either, say, red or green.
hmm
Um, and right away you're like, wow, that's just better because you have more variety. It's more flexible than just getting green.
Yeah.
And the way they typically balance that is there's a hidden cost that it comes in where you can't activate it on the turn you played it, so it's delayed. It's delayed until your next turn before you can use that
There's
card.
some kind of consideration, so it's not just this card, but 10 times better, essentially.
Right. And so if the interesting thing here I was going to get to is that uh, a long time ago, I'm not sure exactly what set this was, but maybe like 20 years ago, they came out with a set of cards that the first dual lands that could activate for red or green, or 2 different colors, they didn't come in with that delayed activation. You could use them right away, and they were super good. And now
Of
they're
course.
ridiculously expensive and rare
hmm
and hard to get. And I think they realized that they made a mistake there by making them so powerful.
hmm
Right. So yes, dual lands OP. Yeah, like you said, Thor. And so they came in, untapped. You could use them right away. And that's ridiculously strong. So what they've done
hmm
since then is they've come out with ones that they come in taps. You can't use them until your next turn. And then they also came out with something called shock lands, where that's the
hmm
slang for them. It's shock land. It's a dual land, and it comes in tapped. You can't activate it right away unless you pay 2 life. So you can damage yourself to activate it right
hmm
away. It'll come in untapped. You can use it right away. And so that's better than the straight. It's sort of like an in between option, right? Like it's good. It's
hmm
better than just not being able to use it all, but you do have to pay a price. But you can choose to pay that price. And I've always sort of seen that entire scenario as a really interesting design problem, and I'm really interested by how they solved that. At first they had something that was super powerful, and then you had these sort of different compromises, and it ends up where there's like different power levels within the
hmm
cards, um, and then because Magic is a game that rotates what cards are legal to play in the standard format, because you can only play cards printed within the last 3 sets. You end up with situations where like there aren't any shocklands in rotations. You can't play with any. Um, that's just sort of a whole other thing.
Yeah.
And anyway, I kind of look at that entire scenario as here's something that's clearly better, here's something that's clearly not as good, and here's something that's in between. And I've tried to apply that to making sure that the same scenario doesn't happen in Revn. Where there's
hmm
okay, well this is the I don't know the fireball ability. You throw a fireball and it does 10 damage, and then here's the lightning ball ability, and it does 25 damage. It's just like, why would you ever use that? Because
Exactly.
if it does 25 damage, it either needs to cost more energy or maybe has a longer cooldown. You just need to find that way
It
to offset it so that there's never a clearly better option.
Yeah, and I just want to say, like, we're about like 20 minutes in the stream. We gotta be really careful because I can see this become like a 4-hour stream in terms of the topics we're talking about here. We may need to turn this into a part two and part three because there is a lot like we can unpack with like each one of the things that we've been talking about. And like for instance, going back to what you were saying about a skill being good or bad based on the player's own skill level. That is another major point about this balance. It's one that I think has become like the doom for a lot of competitive based games today, especially with more of them embracing kind of player skill or player action on top of the character abstraction. So again, stuff like Revn, Overwatch, not so much Counter Strike. They do it's more about the weapons. But again, any kind of like team based or like character based competitive game, because you then throw into that issue of if I'm a really great player, can I use this skill that just makes me completely overpowered? But it only works if I'm in like the top 10% of the players in the game. So how would I guess, and this may even be something you've probably thought of with Revn, like how do you think about balance when you're applying it to the player's skill on top of the actual utility of that ability?
Yeah, that's a really uh, it's a really deep question
Yeah.
there. There's a lot to unpack there, right? That's actually something we run into a lot, I think, with guns in Revn, because
Yep.
I would say that activating an ability in Revn, it's pretty much guaranteed to do its effect. Most of the time, the way they're designed, it's like an AOE of damage, or it does a splash of damage. So it's pretty easy to hit people with abilities for damage. But landing, say a headshot with a sniper rifle, that's player skill right there.
Mm-hmm.
And we've seen countless people who are really popular on Twitch for being able to land those headshots consistently. That's a great way to become a professional gamer, is to
Oh
have
yes.
that really good coordination and ability to pull that off. And that's something we've been studying a lot recently. I've been doing a lot of number crunching of, okay, well, what is the best player going to be able to do, right? Like, how much is their maximum damage output if you were landing every shot perfectly? And I typically balance around that first, because of exactly what you're saying. Like, if you have that just god tier player coming
Mm-hmm.
in, we want to make sure that the experience is competitive for them and playing against them, and then worry about, I think, just offering options for the less skilled players to still have a good experience. I think that some games make the mistake of not balancing around their top tier competitive players. And I think that when you're making a competitive game, you want to
Mm-hmm.
balance your game around the best players and not your middle or your worst players,
Mm-hmm.
because those are the people who are going to push your game to the limits. Those are the people who are going to find your exploits and just
Oh
exploit the
yes.
crap out of them. If they figure out that pistols with headshots are the best way to do damage quickly because you can reload the fastest, you can move the fastest,
Mm-hmm.
you know, that is what they will do. So you have to balance, I think, around the best players, and I think the other players, they learn from the better players. We watch their YouTube videos, we listen to commentary on the pro games. Like, that's how we learn as bronze and silver players. I'm nowhere near good at any sort of video game. I just learn from watching people who are better than me.
Mm-hmm. And not to mention, of course, if people find that pistols are overpowered, if that's what the expert players say, that's going to kind of trickle down to the casual players. And then, like we said earlier, then you run that situation where everybody uses pistols or everybody uses the counter to pistols. And
Yep.
this is one of the reasons why I'm sure with Revn, as we've said before with games like League of Legends, Overwatch, Dota, whatever, that meta always has to be changing, always has to be shifting, because once it becomes stable, your game becomes fixed. And a fixed multiplayer game is pretty much, the nail in the coffin. Because if there's no new balance changes, there's no new updates, then that means there is now objectively the best option. There's that because nope, it's never going to get patched again. So we all know that's going to be it. So why should I take anything else if we know? Again, let's say the pistol is the best option in your game, and the developer's not patching it anymore.
Yeah, I think being able to keep it changing is really important because it just keeps people trying new things, and new things are interesting. Um, I kind of want to talk a little bit um, about gun balance, just because that's what I've been crunching numbers on so much. And I don't know if this is going to show up on stream if I drag this. Probably would. So no.
You may be able to do a screen share through Discord.
Okay, I might do that. Yeah, do that. Um, here we go. So this right here is something that I spend a lot of my time crunching numbers in and trying to figure out what the best way to balance everything is. Um, I'm just waiting to see if it's going to pop up on stream
It actually popped
for
up for a
YouTube.
second, then you moved it away, and then it's now I'm seeing like your background. There
Oh,
you go.
okay. There we go. Okay, great. Sorry about that. So essentially, what I've been trying to calculate here is for each of our guns, is it what is its TTK? What is its time to kill? So time to kill is how many seconds I calculate for body shots, assuming perfect accuracy. You know, how many body shots is it going to take to kill a player at each point in the match? So all this number crunching ends up giving me this graph where the x-axis is how many minutes into the game we are, and most games should last about 20 minutes, maybe 30 minutes at most. And then the other number is the TTK in seconds. And our TTKs are longer, I think, than your average shooter. We try to aim for more of a time to kill that's closer to what you would expect in a MOBA, but maybe a little shorter. Essentially, what I balanced for here is I started by making this thick red line, which was me just sort of having a rough ballpark guess of what I thought might be fun. I thought, okay, early game, maybe it should take 4 seconds to kill someone, and by late game, it should take 5 seconds to kill someone because by late game, you would understand the character is more powerful. Um, and then really, I started looking at, okay, well, how much health do we expect them to have? And that was based on this number right here is basically based on our main health items that are available to buy and upgrade in the game. What is the most what is the sort of the average health you would be gaining over time if you were progressing at an average rate through gaining resources and stuff. So we get that, we add in the same thing for armor, and then we look at the actual stats for the guns that players are using. And I came up with some formulas, and I ended up charting it all out to see that, well, I believe, where's assault rifle? The orange one. Assault rifles take more than 4 seconds to kill someone after about 10 minutes, based on how much health they've gained. At that point, it's going to start taking 6 seconds, and by 15 minutes into the game, it'll take you 10 plus seconds of body shots to bring someone down with an assault rifle. And that's basically anything above this red line is where I would say it starts to feel like a bullet sponge.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and this is like the number crunching I always talk about when it's like, okay, well, first we gotta like get some ground rules and throw everything in there, and then we go and we crunch the numbers and we can fine tune it. And this is the fine tuning, is saying that, hey, there's definitely a problem here. And the solution in our case is there's items you can buy to level up your weapon damage and give it a multiplier essentially. Um, and so the question then is, well, are those strong enough? Is that enough? And essentially, I created this dotted line through some more number crunching to figure out this is what I expect a player to be able to buy in terms of weapon damage upgrades uh, at any point in the match, given how many resources they've gathered and all the other stuff that they're buying. If they're devoting a reasonable amount to it, so there's a lot of like air quotes going on here and like things that are just sort of they're not hard and fast rules, but it gives us some numbers to look at least, because if we just tried to solve for every single problem, we would never get a full graph up.
Yeah.
And at this point, we can see that, okay, the assault rifle, it stays within the acceptable zone up until about 20 minutes in, which is when the game should be ending, and it still flatlines after that below 6 seconds. So it should be reasonably balanced now. But this took several weeks of tweaking all these numbers and then play testing it, and people still complain about, wow, it takes too long to kill someone. And I think player feedback is really, at the end of the day, the most important thing, because I can crunch numbers all day, but if I don't get it right, I miss something, players will let me know.
Oh, they will let you know that that is always the case there. But let me get you back to full screen. There we go. Yeah, and it of course becomes a lot more challenging, as we said. When like, I think what you said there was really smart. That you're kind of trying to come up with either a baseline or essentially like the framework for how you envision the balance of Revn to be. Because if you're constantly changing your foundation during development, you're not just changing it for one gun, you're changing it for every option in your game. You're essentially rebuilding your entire balance system. And it's akin to when we talk in terms of game development, more about people not able to settle on what their core gameplay loop is for a title. If you're changing that 3 years in development, that's 3 years of your time that's pretty much gone. And
Yeah.
it's good that you guys are thinking about that at this early stage in terms of Revn's development, or like at least in the long term, in terms of Revn's development.
Yeah. I think I like really that's why we do this. Like we don't do this expecting that we're gonna get it perfect, for tomorrow's patch or whatever.
Yeah.
It's, do we have a framework to solve these problems, and do we have the context to understand what our players are saying to us? When our players say, and this was very recent, they said, hey, like this guy does way too much damage, and with this gun, but nowhere near enough damage with this gun. Like we had a problem where the it felt like the LMG, our big beefy machine gun, was doing just fine, but the assault rifle wasn't. And when I went in and looked at the numbers, and sure enough, that was exactly what the problem was. Because I don't update the spreadsheet every time we ship out patches. Sometimes the spreadsheet there doesn't get looked at for 3 weeks because we're just working on other stuff, and then we do some small changes. And I finally went in and looked at it. I was like, yeah, what you're saying makes sense because we have the numbers to back it up. And then some of the other stuff they were saying doesn't make sense. And I'm trying to remember exactly what it was someone was saying, but I think it was they were talking about adding more tiers to the weapon bonuses. They wanted more more multipliers to their gun damage, right? Because right now I think it tops out at like plus 60% or something, and they wanted more than that. And this is a player; he's one of our top players in our ranking system. He plays a lot. He's very competitive about the game, and he mainly uses guns in combat. He's a very gun focused player, and he's highly skilled, so that works for him. And he's like, I just want to be able to go even higher with that because at a certain point, I feel like my guns aren't doing enough damage. And he was telling us like, I feel super powerful early game, but if the game stretches out, I can't keep up
The
with you guys.
abstraction is basically taking a hold essentially at that point.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And he was talking about this, and everyone else who's not the number one player in our game, they were like, "Man, this guy's just like complaining that he's already the best. Like, why is he complaining?" You know. But I realized that he was right. That like, yeah, after about 10 or 15 minutes, there was a significant drop off in how fast he could kill people. And I wasn't even really looking at that from like match histories and replays. I went in and looked at the numbers, and I very quickly saw that it was because the armor that was available for people to buy at a certain point was just so strong that you would never be able to kill them in under 10 seconds with really any gun except like a sniper rifle. And like having the framework set up before that problem arrived was really really nice because I had this spreadsheet set up 6 months ago. I set this up last summer, that whole spreadsheet with that graph, and I had a framework, I had all the formulas, and when someone complained, I was able to just go look, crunch it, and get an answer within 5 minutes that this is exactly what was wrong. And if we didn't have that set up, we could have wasted another 2 weeks trying to tweak numbers in game, shipping it out, see how people respond,
Take
ship
it
again.
back. Yeah.
Because we don't have a huge QA team. We actually don't have any QA team. QA, I mean quality assurance. We don't have any full time paid testers for Revn. We're a team of like 7 developers at this point. I like to say 5 to 10. It kind of varies depending on whether you're counting the music guys or things like that. But we've got about 7, 10 developers who are working on this, and we don't have someone who's their only job is to just sit and play the game every day for hours and hours and hours. We rely on our players who they only play the game a couple times a week.
Yep.
So it's how we try and stay lean with our design process. And I saw Thorn has a question on YouTube. You said, "Do I have a vision of where I want to end up, or just looking to see where the players take the game?" I would say that we do have a pretty set in stone vision. There are certain things that we will do and things that we won't do. I'm not sure I have a exact answer, but like some people have asked for certain features or certain design changes, and we just say, no, absolutely not. That's not part of the final vision. I think something that people have asked for repeatedly has been classes in the game. They've been like, "Oh, can we get character classes?" And that just really goes against a lot of our design philosophy and our design principles. And I was just like, no, that we're not going to do that. And I think there's things like that. They're more like features that we won't add or features that we do want to add or we're going to keep in the game. In terms of like balance, I think that's a little bit more player determined. Like in terms of what things need to get adjusted, I don't have any like specific image in mind. A lot of that's just sort of like, how does it feel every week? What are people saying about it?
Yeah. And to clarify, my voice is dying. 1 second. Oh, sorry about that. And to clarify for people who don't know, like with regards to Revn, every player has pretty much a preset character. Like the characters themselves, they don't level up, they don't change. You can't choose like a unique person. It's all based on the weapons, item, and skill loadouts that kind of determine the customization aspect of the game.
Yeah. We don't do character classes. We don't do like heroes or champion selection. It's all based on what stuff you're buying in game. We do have an ability loadout system, which is sort of like a build your own class. But even there, you have some flexibility. You choose 6 abilities for your loadout. You equip 3 of those in game. You've always got 3 alternates to switch to, or like switch out a couple of them. So we try and have this very flexible playstyle where you really end up with something that feels, I think, unique and custom to each player. And I think that's part of the fun of the game is finding those like really cool combinations that maybe the developers didn't think of. I remember, I don't know, maybe it was 5 months ago, one of our playtesters, Spazzy, he figured out that if you took the jetpack ability and then a bunch of these cooldown reduction items that made your cooldowns and all your abilities much shorter, he was able to fly basically infinitely. But in order to pull that off, he had to buy nothing else. He couldn't buy any health items, any shields, any damage, no other ability. He could not buy anything else. He had to spec fully into that to be able to fly around the map constantly.
Yeah,
and I love that. Like honestly, like that's. I don't think you can do that anymore because we reworked the jetpack as part of that big update, and we limited how much cooldown items you can buy because we changed a lot of systems. So that's not possible anymore. But I wasn't really mad that he broke that. I was like, that's cool. Like you can fly, but you're an absolute glass cannon. You take one shot from someone and you're dead. Like,
but you're a rocketeer, so I mean that obviously balances out for the cool factor.
Right. Yeah. And I think it's really cool that when people break things like that. I mean, if like there's a fine line there between it's cool and it's overpowered or it's an exploit, and that's really what I have to look at whenever someone like finds something like that is, okay, but how useful really is it against a fully competitive team? Like, is that going to be just shot down immediately by something? Is it super easy to counter because you're just like I think that those cheeses can be really cool, and if someone can pull it off, and then it can become iconic in some ways. Like, wow, that one person managed to win a game because they were able to fly in and do that one thing, because they thought to do that.
Yeah. And that's always a very tough thing in terms of that balance. Because, again, when we talk about asymmetry like this, you don't know as a developer exactly how all these combinations are going to coalesce together. Like you said with the jetpack example, like that was not something that was originally intended. I'm sure nobody on the design team thought that was going to be possible. But when somebody found it, it then becomes that case of, do we leave it in? Now, obviously, with the jetpack, what you just said, it was eventually it had to be changed along the other elements of the game. But for a lot of other multiplayer-based titles, you had that decision to make of player finds this incredibly powerful build, but it may have like a 5 to 10% chance of actually happening in a match. Do we leave that in, or is it still too powerful? Because we ran into that situation, or Hearthstone had that situation like the first year or like the first 6 months, with I remember watching Miracle Rogue decks, and how it was basically like it may have a very small chance of happening, but people found a way to hit that every time, and it completely broke Hearthstone for like 6 months of play because that was like all powerful.
Yeah, I don't remember that. I wasn't playing Hearthstone much whenever that happened. I think I only played Hearthstone for like 2 weeks in high school. And that was because my best friend was obsessed with the game. Um, but yeah, I think that it always comes down to the developer to decide like, is this just like a one shot thing? Is it a Hail Mary, or is it a full on exploit that's going to work every single time? And I think one thing to look at is it fun for the opponent, right? Does it just ruin the game for them,
Mm-hmm.
to do this one thing? Um, yeah, that's like one of the biggest things I guess to look at in these scenarios. It's like, is it going to be fun if someone can fly around the map?
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. Like that would be a consideration. Like we really didn't have enough feedback at that point when he found this to know like there wasn't really enough people seeing it happen because there's just one player doing it. Like if we had a full live player base and there was a lot of people like just being like, man, it's so annoying when that guy flies around. Then probably I think we would have had to have done something about it.
Yeah.
Um,
And I know as a quick time check, we are hitting 8 o'clock EST now. I guess time wise for you, like what is good for you?
I think I've got time for one or two more questions. That sounds fine.
Okay.
I mean,
In that case, for the people watching, we're going to do last call in chat or last call for questions on chat and now. And again, Silas, if you're free, I am more than happy to do a part 2 or part 3 with you in the future.
yeah. No, this is fun talking about this stuff.
Yeah.
So,
There's two specific topics I want to touch on before I forget them, and
sure.
we'll see how long they take, but in case it does go like 15 minutes, that will be it, at least for me. And for the people watching, it's not my fault this time. Silas does have a schedule to keep to, because everyone blames me when the cast goes early. They also blame me when the
Yeah.
cast runs late, so I can't get out of it no matter what happens.
Thorn, I'll take your question. That was an easy one. Yes, that is a map of Middle Earth behind me. And
Nice.
I have another one of Tamriel over here from the Elder Scrolls. And that's my phone telling me that I need to do things there.
I
That's
got
fine.
bug flying around me too at the same time. All right, but here's the first question that I wanted to bring up, and I wanted to go back to where you were talking about regarding your expert player who brought up the issue that the guns were too weak, because there's definitely like when we talk about multiplayer balance, the player base is both the arbiter as well as the nightmare for the developer when it comes to these kinds of decisions. Because as anyone knows, every time any new piece of content is released in any multiplayer game, people are going to complain it's overpowered, it's broken, you can't use this, it's horrible. We've seen this in pretty much any game that has been released the last 30 years, essentially. And as a developer, you run into that case of, am I listening am I listening to these people, and do I take that's just the icon, the forum. That's just the Discord icon there. He doesn't. Although maybe I should put that in all the future podcasts. Like everybody, all my guests are super hardcore fans of Game Wisdom. Perfect. But back on topic. As a developer, how do you listen to the player base when you had to run this case of, is this thing really overpowered and they figure this out, or as you said earlier, is it perfectly fine but people haven't quite understood what it means yet in the game?
I think whenever your players are complaining, there is a problem, and I think that's like the first thing you should know is like if they're complaining, there is a problem. They just might not know what the problem is.
Yep.
That's what I've learned is maybe like 50% of the time they know what the problem is, and 50% of the time they don't know what the problem is, but they're seeing the symptoms and they're expressing that through they're trying to diagnose
Oh yeah, and that
themselves.
that right there, that's a design topic and a half we could break down in the future.
Yeah, that is something that we. I guess I try to do regular check-ins with our player base to find out sort of how they feel about the broad spectrum of the game. We started doing this a couple months ago. We started doing these monthly surveys. Basically, we send them out through Google Forms, and we ask our players to fill them out. Excuse me. And basically, it only takes a couple minutes for them to fill it out, but it has I don't know, maybe like a dozen questions in it, and most of the questions are like a ranking 1 through 5 of how satisfied, which is a very vague term, how satisfied they are with different aspects of the game. And generally, we've been asking them, how satisfied are you with the tank stuff in the game? How satisfied are you as a tank player or playing
Hmm.
against tanks? How satisfied are you with weapon stuff? How satisfied are you with mobility items and abilities? How satisfied are you as an ability caster focused player? Different things like that. Support, engineer, all these different, like we try to break it down to the different roles so that we can get feedback of like, okay, how do you feel about the role you play? How do you feel about
Hmm.
playing against these other roles? Do you feel like they're too strong against you? Um, and that was something that's a lot more arbitrary data instead of just a specific complaint. And I think that's like really important to get every once in a while is that like this is it's more of a more factual just numbers and ratings and stuff that you can look at, and that tells you okay, that people really just don't like the tank stuff in the game right now, but the weapon stuff is just fine across for the most part, right? That getting those numbers every once in a while is a nice check is really good. Um, but otherwise, like when people complain, like there's a problem 90 out of 100 times there's a problem that they're talking about that you need to look into. So generally what we do when we get complaints about balance and stuff is I'll write it down, I'll file it away, and then at our next design meeting we'll go through and go, okay, well, what is actually causing it? Is it what they're saying? Is there maybe something that's really obvious to us but not to them because we designed it, we know all the connected systems. I think a lot of times like it comes down to oh, this person is just really hard to kill. And they think it's maybe the armor they're using, but it's actually the gun that they're using bad.
Yeah.
People generally want to blame, you know, they don't really want to take it as, oh, well, the gun I was using wasn't good enough. Like I think they're just doing fine.
I could never be the reason why. It's always the game's fault.
Right, right. And like, it's a lot of times it's not the player's fault. It's the fault of a tool they were trying to use. We just didn't design that tool to be correct, or something like that. And that also like broaches on a whole another topic of people complaining about things that aren't design balance problems, but more like graphics and performance stuff where they're like, man, the game runs too slow. And we've had to start filtering that between the people who have 10-year-old graphics cards and the people who have graphics cards that came out last year because sometimes people play your game with hardware that was not meant to run on, and then they tell you, hey, the game runs at 10 frames per second. I got to ask them, like, what graphics card are you using? Because like we ran into that problem where people complaining about frame rate for a couple of weeks, and then I went and I asked everyone. I was like I DM'd them like, "Hey, what specs are you using?" And
Hmm.
turns out we actually did have some performance problems that we ended up solving, and it helped everyone out. But it actually that really helped us solve the problem because once we realized what hardware they were using on, I was able to say, okay, well they only had 1 gig of VRAM on their graphics card. And we went and looked at, okay, well we need a minimum of 2 so we can tell them, hey, this is the hardware you need to play our game successfully. But also we were realizing we were actually like consuming like 5 gigs of VRAM when we should only be using 2, and just gather data. Like that's my takeaway from all of this is gather data, and then go back and look at like what players are saying, kind of compare your data against the subjective feedback.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And again, like this always becomes that case, especially when you introduce new content in your game or something that was never seen before. I remember when I was playing Gwent, like this was way back during I think like the second or third beta, when they introduced a brand new rule mechanic with the spy side for Nilfgaard. That there was nothing like that before in the game. So nobody knew how to counter it. There was no real idea what this was until it came out. And of course, a lot of people right off the bat said this is overpowered, it needs to be nerfed. And they eventually had to change things around like that. But it's always tough, especially when you release any new piece of content, how it's going to fare with everything else that you have in the game. And that is essentially my perfect segue into this final question. And this one could be like a 20 30 minute answer easily when I ask it. But
Oh no.
one of the major things, this is something that you brought up earlier in this cast about multiplayer balance, is how things go over the long term. When, as you said with Revn, that you're hoping to have dozens, if not hundreds, of skills, in the future of the game as it comes out. But as we've said before with asymmetrical content, or even just partial asymmetry, every new piece of content essentially becomes stacked on top of what came before it. And you run into that situation of how do I reasonably balance, or can I reasonably balance 50, 100, 200, 300 different options in a game? And titles like League of Legends have certainly ran into this issue that what are they up to right now? Like several hundred champions,
I think
and
it's like 140.
yeah, like how do you do at that point? Because as we've said, like one of the stand-ins of League of Legends, that every time the new champions release, people immediately say it's overpowered and it's breaking the game. And again, you brought up that example earlier of I have in patch 1 the fireball that does 15 points of damage. Patch 3 I released the lightning bolt that does 40 points of damage. Well, guess what? That fireball is now extinct. But then let's say in 3 more patches we unlock, the super fireball that now does 60 points of damage. And it becomes
Right.
this endless chase. And is there a way from a design standpoint to try to like cut it off before it gets too out of control? I know.
Oh my god, that's
I gave you the
a.
the whammy to end the cast with. This next
How do
question will
you?
be a 2 hour long answer probably.
Right. How do you balance hundreds of items
Hmm.
and things like that? I think my
Answer in
first
2 minutes. Can you do
my
that in
gut answer is you don't. You run away. You don't do that. You can't. There's no hope
Mhm.
for it. But like in all seriousness, I think the way to do that is set up the baselines of weeks. Okay, like your average ability should do. I think I calculated it out. I kind of solved like 20 points of damage per ability at level 1, right? When you first hop into the game, that was sort of my first hard line I set was okay. Well, we know that a character at level 1 has a 100 health,
Mhm.
and I showed you all the graphs for time to kill with weapons and stuff. And weapons aren't really going to change that much. I think I see like you kind of want to set like what are your baselines that are going to change very rarely, if ever. So like I know that characters have 100 health when they spawn. Their guns, the starter assault rifle does 10 damage per shot. The rate of fire is 500. And I'm just going to keep that because that feels good. It felt good. The time to kill is good on that. And there's no real reason to change that because that's your starting equipment. And once you've got that, you've got that sort of baseline. You've got a variable that's been solved. So then I was able to look at, well, okay, well, how much should an ability do for damage? And I kind of picked a number at random that kind of just sounded good. And I was like, well, maybe like 20, 25 points of damage out of an ability kind of sounds reasonable. You can, you're using an ability would take out maybe, takes out a quarter of their health bar, right?
Mhm.
If you land the ability successfully, your average ability would take out a quarter of the health bar. And that could mean different things. That could be throw a fireball that does 25 points of damage. Maybe you stun them in place, and that lets you get an extra 25 points of damage in just because they're not dodging as much as usual, right? And so you're hitting more of your shots, and in that way you're effectively doing 25 more points of damage. So that gives you sort of something to balance around. Of okay, stun should only last long enough that it gains you this much more damage over the dodge percentage, because we can then start calculating percentage of misses based on movement. Um, but then you can also run into things where you're like, well, I want this to be a super ability that does, 100 points of damage, but it does it over like a period of 10 seconds, right? And maybe that's balanced because in the course of 1 second, it only does 25 damage, just like, your other abilities that their casting time is 1 second. And another thing that I've run into there is the reason I think I ended up picking like 20 to 25 is you get three abilities in Revn. So you at maximum could use three things, which each of which would do say 25 points of damage. That's 75 points of damage. The character still has 100 health as their baseline, so you can't kill someone by just going, I'm gonna tap all the buttons on my keyboard and kill you immediately. You know, that's something that that's just sort of another side topic there that I always want to make sure that players have 1 or 2 seconds to respond at least. I'm very against one shot, one kill
Mm-hmm.
mentalities. Like I never want to see someone run out of the spawn doors in Revn with a sniper rifle and headshot someone and kill them at spawn at like the beginning of the game. I never want to see that
Yeah.
because if I see that, I know that something's very wrong.
Or like when I was trying to play like some of the MOBAs, and as a first time player, when you see like those ultimates, you have no idea what they're doing. It's just like here I'm playing. There's a giant particle effect on screen. I'm dead, and I have no idea what just happened. Kind of thing. But that's happened to me many times playing League of Legends and Dota.
Yeah, I think that's like the big thing for me is like give the player who's receiving the damage, the victim, the target. I want them to have just a little bit of time to understand what happened to them, to respond to it, whether that's firing off a couple of shots. You know you're going to die, but at least you damage the enemy. You can maybe get a chance to run away. Have the chance to do something. I never want to see someone come in and just press a button and the player dies immediately with no response. The only time I ever want to see that is if the player's already been damaged or if they've been under leveling. Maybe that's 20 minutes into the game and this player's just been grinding and got all the resources this other player has not been keeping up. In that case, there's really nothing we can do. But if the players have been at keeping up at an even pace, um, I want there to take several actions from the attacker to bring down someone, just so you have a little bit of chance to respond. I feel like I got way off topic here because we're talking about trying to solve balance on hundreds of items. And the way to do that, I think, is to set some baselines that they aren't going to change, and you can sort of expect everything else to evolve around that. And then obviously you still have the option to tweak those baselines, but you know that if you do, it's going to cause this massive ripple through everything
Mm-hmm.
else. So you better pray and hope that you set up some formulas that'll do all that for you automatically.
Yeah, and we saw this kind of with Team Fortress when they implemented their whole side grade item system. That all the items in the game, they not one of them is going to give a character a brand new ability or change the dynamic of that class. Because if they do that, then it effectively breaks the entire class and all the classes in the game. So by going that route, it allows Val to have like hundreds of items per character, knowing full well that's never going to turn the sniper into the soldier, or it's going to make the heavy be as fast and as agile as a scout. Because if you lose that baseline, you basically lose all your balance, and then it becomes that case of we have no idea what's going on in our own game.
Yeah, yeah. Um, I think I think that's about all the time I have for today.
Okay.
I hope some of that was informative to someone somewhere. I feel like I said a lot of things that are probably really obvious to anyone who's spent time thinking about game design. Those are some of the things that I think about on a daily basis working on this stuff, and hopefully we can dig into it a little more in the future with
Yep.
maybe some more I don't know, either more specific issues or maybe more. I don't know. We should find something that's a little more, um, I don't know, maybe more meaty about these balance problems.
Yeah. And like I said, if anything comes to your mind, definitely send me a message. And yeah, we can certainly have you back on. There's plenty of time open in 2020 to do more podcasting.
We're just getting started.
Yes. But Silas, it was a pleasure having you on. If you wouldn't mind hanging on Discord for like 20 seconds after we end the call, that would be great.
Absolutely.
But I guess very quickly, for people who want to learn more about Revn or follow you, if you have any social media you would like to pitch or promote, feel free.
Yeah. So if you aren't already following us on Twitter, we have the handle at Ambitious Devs. We're also under the handle Revn Game, REVN Game. You can go to our website, revngame.com. All of our links are on there, including our Discord server, which is probably the best place to learn about the game and get in contact with me, ask questions, and you can even get a key there to help us test the game and be one of these people who tells me that everything is broken and doesn't.
Or that every skill is perfectly balanced and they don't need to do any more balancing whatsoever.
I wish someone would join and do that. That would be nice. Please do that.
And as a quick update for people watching their live recorded, in terms of the future of Revn, do you have any soft or hard dates in terms of the game going to early access, new builds, things like that?
Um, I would say we are aiming for some sort of release later this year. We're soft target for this summer for something. I don't know if that's beta or full release. We're kind of coming up on beta, I feel like. Sort of our beta milestone at this point is do we have the storefront? Do we have all these things to, like, make it a final game? They're just not polished yet. That I guess is our beta for me. Is like, is the game finished but not ready? Like, and I think we're coming up on that. We've got the storefront prototype. We got a bunch of stuff that we have to polish out with it. So I think we're coming up on beta quicker than we expected, and we might be releasing this summer, hopefully.
All right, great. And for your fans watching me right now, for anybody new watching this recorded, you can follow me on Twitter at GWBicer. There's a link to my Discord down below as well as to our Patreon. Or all Patreons who donate at least $5 or more will get early and ad-free access to all these design talks. Other than that, I'm trying to think if there's anything else. For my people watching, I'll be back later tonight for our regular game streams. There'll be links to Revn as well as to our previous casts in the description down below. But other than that, I think that is going to do it. So, again, Silas, it was great having you on. And for any developers watching this right now who would like to come on for a discussion, we're always looking for new guests. So please don't hesitate to get in touch. We'll come back for daily discussions on game design here and on game wisdom, where we some of the art and science of games. Until next time, have a great night.